It's my great pleasure to introduce our distinguished keynote speaker, Richard Good, who is Executive Director of Climate Change and Sustainability Services at EY. We're grateful to Rich for stepping in for his colleague Brendan LeBlanc, who is unable to be with us this morning. As he comes to the stage, he's right here, so I guess it won't take that long, let me share a few highlights. Rich Good is an Executive Director at EY, U.S. Climate Change and Sustainability Services Practice. He has experience in developing and implementing environmental, health, and safety programs at large organizations, as well as expertise in carbon accounting, supply chain sustainability, and strategy development. Before joining EY, Rich was head of global sustainability for Alcatel-Lucent. He is currently an adjunct member of the faculty at Harvard University, where he teaches a class on greenhouse gas emissions and corporate sustainability. His full bio, as with all of our speakers, is in your kit. Please welcome Richard Good.
Well, good morning all, and thank you to Claire and Luana for having me here, and really great to be with you today. Let's see. Is this going to work for me, or do I have to point at a certain spot? There we go. Today I'm going to tell you a story. I'm going to tell you a story about risk, a story about trust, and a story about value. But, let's see, should I say next slide? But most importantly, I'm going to tell you a story about how accountants are going to save the world. So 5 years ago, my friend Peter Bacher, who's a CEO of the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, he wrote this article for the Harvard Business Review, and here's just an excerpt. But in the article, he talked about, in his previous job as CEO of TNT, a global logistics company, he had volunteered his company's considerable time and expertise in responding to some really large global disasters, so hurricanes and tidal waves and so forth. And he did that pro bono, for no fee. And at the end of that, he was reflecting on the experience there. He said, even though I didn't get any revenue out of this, my company certainly got a lot of value. He realized that his reputation improved, the employees were more engaged, and that work really gave his company some of the best training on how to respond to complex logistical challenges. Yet, the trouble was, none of this value was able to be captured on his balance sheet. How do I show that value when our present system only really prioritizes financial capital, not the other things like social, human, or natural capital? So quick poll, who likes pizza? All right. Now, you're going to have to let me know later if this subliminal message made you buy pizza for lunch or dinner. By the way, me too, my brothers and sisters in cheesy goodness. I showed this picture of pizza oven simply because it doesn't matter how many pizza ovens you have, you can't make pizza if you don't have any dough. We know that sustainability means meeting your needs in a way that allows future generations to do the same. But we're using our resources at an unprecedented rate, and we're simply not measuring much of it. Clean air, water, soil, things that we just take for granted. Those are things that we're using at this unprecedented rate, yet we're not measuring much of it. Now, most of us would agree that not having access to these things would be a real risk to their business. If these things matter, why aren't they measured? They matter from everything from the local pizza shop on the corner to large multinational companies to large professional services firms. Let's look at the role that sustainability has played in organizations over the years and how they've sort of changed in responding to the risk that we face, the sort of changing risk. Thank you. So the good news is that the role of sustainability in organizations, so I was a head of sustainability for a large company before, and really we were started in this sort of philanthropy, and I call it the changing light bulbs stage. We're sustainable because we put in compact fluorescents. Well, not exactly. But now you're seeing that change to more integrated corporate social responsibilities, and even in some leading companies, what I call integrated sustainability strategies, where sustainability is part of a lot of major decisions, especially companies that understand purpose. And it helps to drive that trust, because what it's doing is making sure that things that matter, these risks that are now facing more and more companies, are integrated into daily decision making. But this new risk landscape of reduced resources, investor activism, global competition, volatility, and the velocity of change, sustainability needs to operate at higher levels. And I call it the G word, governance. Governance is really another fancy word for management. Is sustainability integrated into the governance or the management of the company? And then finally, is it seen as a fiduciary duty? That's where we see sustainability going in the long run. But I think this more interesting slide, the next one, is really about the risk landscape and how it's changed over the last 10 years. If you look on the left in 2008, or it's broken up by the likelihood of risks and the impact of those risks. And in 2008, anything that had to do with environmental, it's only one societal risk there as likelihood. Now in 2018, look at how it's changed. The top few likelihood are extreme weather events and natural disasters, and particularly here in New York City, we all remember Superstorm Sandy, and the impact that had on infrastructure, financials, as well as everyday life, just trying to get to work. And let's not forget, Superstorm, that wasn't even a hurricane. It was a hurricane while it was in the Atlantic, but by the time it swept in, it was still just a tropical storm. So imagine if that were a Category 3 hurricane. And now the impact of extreme weather events and natural disasters. These are the type of risks that companies are saying we're now facing. And if it's a climate risk, and it could be potentially material to your business, investors and others want to know about it. So let's talk about how those risks get put into the enterprise risk management framework. Shout out to one of the sponsors here, the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, a great organization. EY was lucky enough to help them a little bit with conducting some of this research. And what we looked at was the alignment between risks in their risk filing, so talk about their annual corporate report, the annual report, 10K, 20F, whatever you might have, and their climate risk disclosure, so their sustainability report or their corporate, their CDP response, Carbon Disclosure Project. And we looked at the risks that you laid out in the annual filing as well as their sustainability filing. Now, these are filings that came from the same company, presumably through the same approval channels. And we tracked the linkage. So if you said there's a risk here in corporate and your risks over here in sustainability, how many were the same or aligned? And it looked like only about 29% of those risks were actually aligned, meaning, best way to show you is to show you. So what we did is we then went deeper. So 29%, we're thinking, okay, we're getting there. 29%. Only 8% of companies actually had full alignment, in that on their sustainability report on the left, they would name things like raw materials, and then tie it back with their core risk filing, like raw materials risk. So only 8% of companies had what we would call full alignment. About half of companies, a little more than half, had partial alignment, typically around things like pollution and accidents, back to compliance risk. It's a start. That was encouraging to see. However, the big story was this. 35% of the companies that we talked to and looked at had absolutely no alignment between what they said their climate risks were and their corporate or their core business risks. And to me, this was the scariest of all of the charts. I said earlier that this is a story about risk, trust, and value. Now, for the 35% of companies there that have no alignment between their risk filing and their sustainability report, what does this tell us about risk and how they understand their own risks? How can I trust what I read about risk if two company-published reports are so different? Are you not talking to each other? Is sustainability really not taken seriously? Do you think that the climate does not have an impact on your business? What sort of value do you think they might be leaving on the table here by not integrating these risks? Because remember, not all risk is bad. risk can lead to opportunity as well. Companies don't make big advances without taking a gamble. I think a lot of people think of risk as only bad, but risk is an opportunity as well. And then further, from an investor standpoint, for these 35% of companies that have absolutely no alignment, do I want to invest in them? Do you? So we talked about risk. Well, I guess we'll add to this is the TCFD, the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. So if anybody hasn't heard of that, tcfd.org, I'd urge you to go take a look at that. What they're encouraging companies is to have a conversation, disclose what exactly are the risks that you're facing from a climate perspective. I think a lot of companies think of climate as something for the business to manage, when in actuality, it's the other way around. You have to figure out how to manage your business in the face of climate risks. No company that I know can stop the path of a hurricane or stop sea level rise all by itself. This is something that you have to manage the impacts from, not to. And the TCFD, they lay out sort of a governance, a four-step framework, which is governance, strategy, disclosure, and metrics. Now, I can really boil down TCFD to a couple of simple ideas. One, the message to businesses: have the conversation at the highest levels of the organization. Are we at risk from climate change? Any sort of extreme weather events, maybe our supply chain, maybe our raw materials. We were helping a client not that long ago understand their exposure to climate risk. And when we brought up supply chain issues, they had never thought about that before. So, well, this raw material will really be at risk, and we can't make our products. Go back to the pizza example. You can't make pizza if you don't have dough. You can't make your products if climate change means that your main raw material is now wiped out, or is in really short supply. So it's really about having a conversation. Now look, not every business has a material risk from climate change, and that's fine. What investors want to know, investors are behind TCFD, they want to know, have you had the conversation? And are you at risk? Because if I'm going to invest in you, I want to know that you've at least had the conversation. And then disclosure. This conference is about purpose and about trust. Disclosure, my colleague who couldn't be here, Brendan LeBlanc, has a great saying, says, sunshine is a great disinfectant. And what that means is you've had the conversation. We've determined that maybe one or two areas of climate are material to our business. And here's what they are, and here's what we're doing about it. That sort of frank talk engenders trust. And trust, as we'll see later, and how it links to value, is not something that's really high in terms of what people think about businesses today. Long-term value. So trust is linked to value, and trust is long-term focused. A lack of trust leads to this sort of short-termism. I'm going to give you a little bit of my investment today. I'm going to take it out at the first sign of trouble. So EY, and I'll talk a little bit about how we're working on this. We looked at long-term value. What drives long-term value? And we came down that there are certain inputs. Trust is certainly one. You have to trust that. You have to trust an organization and invest in them. You have to, and if you're a consumer, you want to trust the organizations you're buying from. Big data, and that seems to be everywhere. And we'll talk a little bit about the role of data and how we're better able to use it. It's the shape of value. What is long-term value versus short-term value, and then the investment disconnect. So in other words, these four issues we feel come together to help frame the discussion on long-term value, which is linked to trust. The long-term value debate, trust the first one, and trust in the establishment, including entities, and companies and businesses, is really at an all-time low. More than half of us think that CEOs are not credible when faced with a hard decision. More than half of us also think companies won't do what's right for the community that they operate in. That's a rough place to start from. And if trust is a key driver in creating and sustaining long-term value, we have quite some way to go here. Big data. So what's big data and how do we use it? So I, for one, I'm not really terribly interested with a microwave oven that has an IP address and tells me its status. That's information I don't need to know. But I do want to know if all this data that's out there, like IP connected refrigerators and ovens, if all that data can come together and tell me something. I started my career in statistics, and what I always loved is when I did a survey, I'd get it back, I knew that there was a story in these numbers. This cross-tabulated table, I knew there was a story in the numbers, and my job was to find the story. Now, I'm no longer anywhere near smart enough to make sense of smart data. That's why we have all these great colleagues of mine at EY that can figure that out. But I think we think that there's a story in those numbers, a story about value, and particularly hidden value, and how can we unlock it and help drive the discussion for long term. This shape of value, this can really be boiled down to what I call the iceberg, the value iceberg. I've probably given this slide in my classes and at forums, 20 times in different forums, and I just have an iceberg, meaning showing there's a little bit above the water and an awful lot below. And 40 years ago, the average company's market capitalization, or their market value, about 80% was tied up in property, plant, and equipment, tangibles, durable things. And only about 20% was in what we call intangibles, reputation, goodwill, and so forth. Now in 2018, that has flipped. The average company, almost 3/4 or more of their value is tied up in intangible assets, goodwill, reputation. And let's take reputation for a minute. If more than half, or maybe even 3/4 of your company's market cap is tied up in reputation, that makes a bad PR event all that much more frightening for a CEO. If it's going to impact your reputation, and that's maybe 1/3 or 1/4 of your market value, and it can disappear overnight, that makes having that trust, that capital with your customers, with your employees, with your regulators, all that much more important. So the shape of value has changed to be more focused on the intangibles. And really think about some of the companies you may do business with. Do they own their buildings? Do they own their desks? Or are they really just more about an intangible value? Even at EY, our biggest asset is our name, Ernst & Young, because without that, no one would take us seriously in signing any company's opinions. And finally, the investment disconnect. So against the backdrop of everything I've talked about so far is the undeniable fact that we are ruthlessly short-term focused. I was having a conversation with a friend I went to college with, and we're both old enough that our college degrees are old enough to have college degrees. And he went into sales. And I asked him how he was doing. He said, this is the most important quarter of my career yet. I said, I saw you last year, and I seem to remember you saying the same thing. And maybe even the year before that. He says, yeah, I'm in the 100th most important quarter of my career. And it's that short-term drive. And it's just relentless. This finding here by this study MGI did, that there's been believed there's up to $1 trillion in value, $1 trillion in value, just waiting to be unlocked by taking a longer-term view. And we see a few examples of companies that are actually saying, look, I'm no longer going to issue quarterly financial reports. I'm only going to give you an annual report, simply because we know we're going to be here for the next 20, 30, 40 years, and we believe in building long-term value. And because of that, we're going to stop the madness of quarterly reporting. And if you don't make a quarterly number, somehow that means you're not good enough anymore. I'm going to pull my money out of you. It says, we don't want your money. That kind of value, that kind of thinking is sort of the first step into creating long-term value. Well, so what do we do about this? We've got this short-termism. The title of my talk is Measuring What Matters. And at EY, one thing we really know how to do is measure things. So let's look at how we would measure long-term value. So to measure anything, you need a framework. And ideally, that framework has some criteria. We love criteria at EY. And because that framework and that criteria helps articulate what the outcome will be. What is your outcome here? So your outcome will have something that tells you, it's a barometer. How are you doing towards creating this thing that your framework is designed to build? So we started with sort of this holistic view of the organization: purpose, strategy, governance, context, its strategic assets, key stakeholders, and used this kind of as a backdrop and went forward and said, we're going to join a few friends in helping to determine and test this model. Does this work? Are these reliable indicators for figuring out what exactly is long-term value? So some of these friends, who are these friends? Global companies, thought leaders, market movers, investors with trillions of dollars in assets under management, companies with combined market cap of well over $1 trillion. And we're part of this group now called Project Embankment. And you can all just do a quick Google search on Project Embankment and learn more about it. But in short, Embankment is a project whose goal is to transform the way businesses measure and report on the value they create for shareholders. Now let's go back to Peter Bacher's story, WBCSD. He knew that he created a lot of value for his company in terms of reputation, their experience, engaged employees, but he couldn't put that on the balance sheet. There's no entry for that. So Embankment is designed for sort of a first step to trying to measure the type of value that is not purely financial in nature. The Project Embankment has a few different goals. The first is to develop this framework that will help enable trust in what you're seeing a company invest their money in. The second is this, helping to achieve inclusive capitalism. So inclusive capitalism, this is something we think can help organizations restore trust and build a more sustainable future. And inclusive capitalism means not only bringing more people into the capital fold, but including more types of capital. There's human capital, there's natural capital, there's social capital. And part of Embankment, our role in Embankment here at EY is to help develop this proof of concept framework that I just showed you. And it'll be tested by asset managers, asset owners, and asset creators, so corporations. And we believe this framework will help lead to a better and more transparent approach for shareholders to understand, measure, and compare, and that's important, the investments companies make in things like purpose, brand, intellectual property, products, employees, and other things. So it's really about including all these types of capital. And many times on balance sheets today, you'll just see a line item for intangibles or goodwill without a whole lot of explanation of what it is or how exactly it's calculated. And there's a framework, there's a methodology for sure, but we're looking to really expand that, widen the discussion. What sort of capitals matter? And how do you measure them? And how do you show your investors, your stakeholders, your key stakeholders, that you're investing in these things? Because a lot of companies are reluctant to invest their hard-earned dollars into things that can't be valued, that no one would ever see that this is what the company's investing in. And that's really part of inclusive capital, to help drive that conversation on trust. So while the title of this story is really measuring what matters, it's also the subtitle is it's an incomplete journey. So right now, we're not there yet. It's a hypothesis. After all, you can't change our entire financial system overnight. So our hypothesis includes these sort of ideas that outcome metrics are meaningful indicators of long-term value, that you can actually determine what are the elements of long-term value. That we have information with this big data. Disclosure is an issue. Disclosure really links back to trust. I talked about risk, trust, and value, and disclosure is about trust. If you're in sustainability and you're writing your sustainability report, if your general counsel's not worried or not pushing back, you're not pushing hard enough. They should always be a little bit worried and push back about what it is you want to talk about. Metrics we'll talk about, and that data analytics are a key enabler. That's why we have all these wonderful, smart people. It's part of Project Embankment, designed to take all this data we have and find the story in the numbers. Where are the indicators of hidden value and long-term value? There's lots at stake here. Things like purpose, brand, community, employees, they're all very important. But currently, there is not a consistent way to measure that value that investment in these things creates. This means that companies may be reluctant to do that. And long-term value is about showing the investments you make and what the outcomes are. It's one thing to invest in training in your employees, but what did that provide for you? What did that training provide? Was it increased retention? And what does that retention yield in terms of a financial growth and value? And really, like I said, this is really new thinking. This is all about creating that long-term value, not that traditional short-term value that's only been financially focused. And the outcome metrics. Right now, our idea is that there's 3 levels of metrics. So there's company-specific metrics that will be unique, sort of bespoke to each company. Sector-specific, consumer products, life cycles. There will be things that are indicators of long-term value. This helps the comparison approach. So the company-specific are ones that fit your particular facts and circumstances. The sector-specific ones are the ones that you can compare more broadly, and then universal. They go across all companies. And we think as we develop this and test this as part of Project Embankment, you'll see more and more on these type of metrics. And then when you can see them measured consistently, that training yields this, that investment in purpose and brand yields that, investment in employees yields this. Not only will you as investors be better able to understand what kind of value that's generating, companies will be more willing to invest in these intangible things because they know there's a return on that investment. And that's key. If there's a return on that investment that meets their hurdle rate, their objectives, builds trust, helps them grow, they're more likely to put money into that. So I've told you a story about risk, trust, and value, and long-term value creation, and how a small but important group of organizations in Project Embankment are setting out to help gain trust back and to be transparent about risk and build some long-term value. To paraphrase Peter Bacher and the rest of his story in the Harvard Business Review, he says, if business wants to restore society's trust, they must be more transparent about the use of natural resources, acknowledge the risks to their business from a resource-constrained world, and factor that into day-to-day management. Those who get this right will be rewarded with higher sales, better returns, more engaged employees, social license to operate, reduce risk, and be more trusted. In short, more able to build long-term value than those who fail to change the way that they operate. This isn't an incremental change, but a radical transformation. A radical transformation in the way we do business and measure value. And it's the accountants who will lead the way. Thank you.
Questions? If you would bring them on question cards, please. And I have a few to start off with. Rich, you talked a little about the changing role of sustainability. How can sustainability be more integrated into company management?
So that's a great question. So integration of sustainability into company management really is sort of like the TCFD example I used, which is really just have the conversation at the highest levels, making sure that company management is engaged. I think sustainability used to really be about reducing your energy use and your carbon footprint, which is very important, but that's a start. And then as those quick wins started to balloon and the companies see more concrete financial returns, it started to gain into more integrated corporate social responsibility and sustainability. Now it's really a matter of governance. I still see sustainability or corporate social responsibility in a lot of companies as a separate sort of off to the side organization that doesn't really have a seat at the table. I think that the answer to that is it's really about having sustainability, having a seat at the table, and at least having that conversation. What's the impact of these key issues, these big global megatrends on our business, and how should we respond?
So I'll just speak loud.
Okay.
There are already many approaches to metrics. Why are you creating another one? For example, SASB, GRI,
we love metrics. I think that's a valid point. And very oftentimes our clients are frustrated. They come to us and say, this alphabet soup of acronyms, SASB, GRI, CDP, DJSI, LMNOP, what should I do? What should I focus on? And what I like about what Project Embankment, it's less of a focus purely on disclosure, but more about figuring out how to measure value. So a lot of the other metrics are about how to show what you've done. I think they're sort of lagging indicators. Here's what we've done, and here's what we can do. Here's what we plan on doing about it. And I think Project Embankment, just given the variety, it's not just EY coming up with this. It's a lot of companies who are frustrated about the investments they're making in non-financial areas that are never captured. So given the impetus behind this, to actually create value and improve their balance sheet and show this in terms of here's an acknowledged indicator I can put on my balance sheet that improves my market cap and my return to shareholders. I think that's what makes this a little bit different.
Okay, next one. How long do you think it will take for companies to realize long-term value using these kinds of techniques?
So it's definitely a journey, but having a few companies, particularly some of the ones that are part of Project Embankment, that are issuing quarterly reports and instead issuing annually and talking about long-term value, it really takes a small but committed group of leaders to start. How long? I hope it's before I retire, I think it's a journey, and I think you're going to see some leading companies do it, and then others follow. But once this framework becomes generally accepted, and it's something that the accounting profession can count and measure and show that it's done correctly according to a framework and criteria, that will accelerate its adoption.
Okay. Different companies might have different risk footprints, so how do you get apples to apples comparisons with a single framework?
Sure. The framework, I think, has three separate levels of metrics. So company, sector-specific, and then sort of universal. And the sector-specific will enable more comparison across sectors, and then the universal will be smaller, but enable that apples-to-apples comparison across. Because with each metric, it has to be something that is repeatable, has clear criteria, and that the companies can find it and publish it, calculate it and publish it.
Okay, a question. In the 35% that you had your slide, are there any data on, I can't quite read the word, Gen Z and millennials?
I don't think we looked at that as part of that
Let's look
data.
at that, because that could be a leading indicator. If those companies don't have correlations in getting new hires from Gen Z and millennials, that could be a harbinger of their slow decline.
Great, thank you.
How can companies better integrate their climate risks into enterprise risk management?
That's a key point. And we've been working with the WBCSD on this to help integrate climate risk into the enterprise risk management framework. Enterprise risk management is really a process of determining which risks are material. And material is it started out as an accounting word, but really what it means is important. Is this important enough that if this event happened or this thing happened, it would impact investors' willingness to invest in the company? And there are risks that are climate related that have become material to many companies, particularly companies with in the utility, oil and gas industry that have large amount of assets in weather-prone areas. So the WBCSD has just issued sort of a report on how to have that conversation. So if you're in the sustainability or corporate social responsibility group, and someone else is in the enterprise risk management group, and never the twain shall you meet, it's a framework for having that discussion, who becomes involved in the discussion, and how you lay out those risks quantitatively in a way that helps make the determination of whether or not they're material and how to get them onto the risk register. It's a simple matter of what's the likelihood and what's the impact. And anything that has a high likelihood and a high impact on the business really becomes in that quadrant that's material and needs to be disclosed and then needs to be acted on. Because any risk, you have to then determine how do you treat it. Do you accept it? Do you transfer it? Do you mitigate it? Do you avoid it? Or do you even exploit it?
So following up on that, how do you get people out of their silos to talk about these kinds of risk disclosure issues inside a company that might be global, spanning different companies, different governmental environments, different risk environments?
That's a great question. I think there's two ways that happens. One is FOMO, fear of missing out. You see other companies doing it and saying, well, wait a minute, if they're doing it, nobody really wants to be, very few companies want to be the leader. A lot want to be a fast follower. So seeing some of the leaders do this and then bringing this to your management and saying, they're all doing it, maybe they know something we don't. And the other is sort of the carrot and stick approach, or maybe just a stick approach. Larry Fink's letter to global CEOs. Larry Fink, CEO of BlackRock Capital. This is not a small investor. It's the largest institutional investor in the world. And his letter basically said in a nutshell, we invest in you, and we want to see you start talking about more than just the financial capital that you're creating. What social capital are you creating? What good are you doing for the world? What is your long-term value? And when the largest investor in the world says something, generally people listen. Because if BlackRock just dumped all those stocks, I think it would be traumatic for a lot of companies.
Is there really a lot of investor pressure around this issue now, or is it just Larry Fink talking?
I think that's a great way to look at it. 5 years ago, you'd have a small, or 10 years ago, you have a small group of people come to an annual meeting, investor activists, and waving signs, and maybe they get removed by security. Then it turns to the small, socially responsible investing firms, people who invested more altruistically and wanted to see their money go for good, the creation of good, rather than something that they don't feel is good. But now you're seeing it go mainstream. I see it as a rising tide rather than sort of, I don't know if I'd say just Larry Fink. BlackRock's pretty big, pretty important. But my view is they're going to make an example out of someone. They're going to publicly pull investments in a meaningful way from one company. And when I say this to my clients, they'll say, well, how do we know who that will be? It's easy. What they're asking you to do is pretty simple. It's not transformative. It's have a conversation in the C-suite about whether or not climate change and these other types of capital are going to impact your business. Can you get the raw materials to run your business? Can you get enough dough to make pizza? That's not really difficult. And then the next step is disclose it, talk about it. And if there's a material issue, say it's material. If some people don't invest in you, then they don't invest in you anymore. It's really as simple as that.
Do you see business interest in this issue, investor interest in this issue, especially around climate change, possibly driving policy in the future?
I do, despite sort of maybe what's happening at the national level in terms of regulations. Ever since the TCFD has been published and a few companies have started actually issuing TCFD reports in their corporate filings. So the big difference with TCFD is they don't really see this in your sustainability report. They want to see it in your 10K. They want to say, we had this discussion, we conducted a scenario analysis, and here are the results. Maybe it's only qualitative, and we're helping some clients conduct scenario analyses around what is the impact? What does your business look like in a 2-degree world? And I think that the more that conversation happens, the more you'll see this disclosure.
For those of us who aren't right in that world, is TCFD a climate disclosure report?
TCFD is really an organization chaired by Michael Bloomberg and others that is designed to ask companies to at least have the conversation about climate risk and whether or not it impacts your business. So they're more investor driven.
Is it linked to SASB, where I know Michael Bloomberg is also?
They're represented, so TCFD is well represented from all the big four, SASB, GRI, Focal Point, and the major stock exchanges.
Okay. Here's a question about the nonprofit sector. How can the nonprofit sector leverage this to help grow a company's intangible value?
I think with nonprofits, it's really the same: risk, trust, and value. You can call attention to the risks that the companies in your organization are facing, help them build that trust through disclosure, and with understanding the risks, addressing them, and disclosing them, that helps build value. Trust is a core indicator of long-term value. So I think it's having that conversation about how to build long-term value.
Is there anything more for nonprofits or even smaller enterprises to do in the sustainability assessment of their own operations and disclosure?
It never hurts to practice what you preach. You don't have it. It's really, to me, TCFD, whenever my clients come to me and say, I can't make sense of these alphabet soup of acronyms, it's really about having a conversation. How am I impacted? How am I impacted, and then how does the impact on me affect my customers, my clients, my constituents? So it's really as simple as having that initial conversation and then figuring out what to do with it.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Rich. How measuring what matters can help drive long-term value. In particular, I'm struck by that flip in the intangible versus tangible and how that relates to trust. So thank you.